Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was faster. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Lixora from AO3. So let's start the video. Izuku peeked over the rooftop edge and looked down at the chaos below him. Two people were in the center of the chaos. One was sprawled out on the ground while the other was standing across from him with pride. "Get up," he muttered to himself, praying that the guy on the ground would get up and continue his fight. Izuku's head shot up at the sound of footsteps, but he relaxed once he realized who it was. His friend had finally gotten up and started to walk over to the roof edge, holding a hand to his side to cover the wound that was still bleeding a bit. Izuku felt bad that he didn't have the energy to heal him fully. He was shocked that he could heal it that much in the first place. "Be careful," Izuku warned, not wanting his friend's wounds to get worse. He would have told him to sit back down, but he knew that wouldn't happen. "I'm fine," was the response he got, and it was what Izuku expected. Izuku turned his attention back to the battlefield and frowned when nothing had changed when he looked away. A part of Izuku's mind told him that the man on the ground was unconscious and that he couldn't get up, while another part had a hope that he would get up and continue his fight. The logical part of his brain told him that even if the man was able to get up, he wouldn't have enough power to continue fighting. At this moment he wished he had a quirk that could fix all of this. Maybe time travel. That would have been useful in many situations in his life. Maybe if he could travel back he could fix all of this. None of it would happen. Izuku focused on the unconscious man's quirk, aware that if he was going to do this, he had to do it quickly. The second man was slowly making his way to the unconscious man, acting as Izuku's timer. His time would run out once he made it across the battlefield into the unconscious man. Izuku assumed that the man was monologuing. Not that the other could hear it since he wasn't even conscious. The man thought that he won, but Izuku was always there to ruin his plans. It wouldn't be the first time and it certainly wouldn't be the last. He took a deep breath and waited as long as he could. He had to give the man a chance to get up and fight for himself, a chance to prove that part of his mind wrong. However, as Izuku watched the second man get closer, he realized that he had to do this. He had no choice. "Just do it," his best friend spoke from beside him. Knowing what Izuku's dilemma was by the way he fidgeted with the hem of the glove he was wearing. "You know what will happen if you don't." Izuku took a deep breath but didn't answer him back. He knows all too well about the consequences if he doesn't do this. He doesn't want to, but he has to. He removed one of his gloves and held his hand out, feeling his parents' powers swirl together as he focused on the unconscious man's quirk. He had to do this. He knew that. If he didn't, then the whole world would end. So why was he hesitating? The man stopped in front of the unconscious one. His time was out. Izuku focused on the quirk and pulled it toward him before he could second-guess himself any further. The second he pulled on it, the man had finished crouching in front of the unconscious one and was just starting to reach his hand out. Izuku felt the power surge through him as the quirk tried to settle into his body. It was so powerful that he fell back at the force of it. He was lucky that his friend was there to catch him, letting out a pained groan at the motion. He took a few deep breaths as he felt like he was about to explode while he watched green lightning travel up his arm and then fizzle out as the quirk finally settled. Izuku felt his consciousness start to slip as the effects of taking such a strong quirk began to hit him, while also dealing with the drawbacks of quirk overuse. He knew the quirk was strong, but he didn't expect it to be this strong. The man's head slowly turned to Izuku's direction and he put down his hand. He had his vision locked on Izuku as he started to stand up. The man lifted his arm and a red and black orb started to form at his palm. Izuku froze as he recognized the quirk. "Shit," he cursed. "I think that's our cue to get the fuck out of here." His friend panicked. Izuku shakily nodded as he quickly moved to grab his friend's hand so he could teleport them to safety. He didn't have much energy left to teleport both of them, but he had to try. As much as he wanted to save his friend, he wanted to save himself. Even though it sounded selfish, he did so much to stay free and he wasn't letting that all go to waste. He focused all of his energy away from his other quirks and on the teleporting quirk. He needed a large amount of energy to teleport two people to a far location, but he barely had enough for one. The use of the man's quirk was close to suffocating as it grew more and more like a ticking time bomb. Izuku had to work fast to make sure that he was faster. His hand eventually lit up a pale green and he focused on his home, making sure to focus on taking his friend with him. He tightly shut his eyes and tightened his grip on his friend as green light surrounded the two of them, but it was too late. The quirk went off and hit Izuku the second the teleportation happened. The quirk hit his right side, causing Izuku to cry out in pain. Thankfully, it missed his friend so he wouldn't have to worry about that. The teleportation caused the two of them to land hard on the warehouse floor with a thud. Izuku hissed at the excruciating pain in his side. His side felt wet. He knew it was blood and there must have been a lot of it because he felt soaked. Figures, he avoided getting hurt the whole fight. If only he was fast enough. If only he was stronger. 𝐬𝐬, his friend yelled, running to his side. Oh shit. Oh fuck. 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 He let out a string of curses as if that would change anything. I'll be fine. 𝐬𝐬's voice surprisingly still worked. It was strained, but it worked. Bullshit. He could hear the panic in his voice. 𝐬𝐬 went through the shit show that just happened. If only he was faster. All of this could have been avoided. But what if that wasn't enough? What if he needed to do something earlier in his life? Thoughts like that ran through his mind as he went through the events, but his most recent action stuck in his mind longer than he would have liked. 𝐬𝐬 took a deep, pained breath and laughed. It wasn't a joyous laugh, more hysterical and painful if anything. His friend yelled at him to stop laughing. He was somewhere else in the warehouse. 𝐬𝐬 assumed he was getting the first aid kit. That wouldn't help him now. He was as good as dead and he already accepted that. It's not like it mattered if he died, he would just come back since he had that stupid revival quirk. It seemed as if his fate had come full circle, but not the way it was meant to be, and now he was getting punished for it. I did it. Oh my god, I actually did it, he cried hysterically. I took his quirk. He let out a few pained coughs. He could feel his friend trying to frantically put bandages around his torso. I took it and now I'm getting punished for it, he said weakly before his vision faded. The last thing he heard was his friend yelling at him to stay awake before everything went black. How was this the outcome of everything? 𝐬𝐬 wasn't even sure how it got this bad. He knows logically that he shouldn't blame himself, but he couldn't help it. It's easy to wonder about what you could have done to prevent a bad event from happening. All 𝐬𝐬 needed was to be faster. Maybe if he was faster, then this wouldn't have happened. Maybe it would have just been postponed. Maybe it was just inevitable and what he did or didn't do simply didn't matter. Even if the question may not matter, it still was hard for him not to ask. Where did I go wrong? Where did I go wrong? That was a question that 𝐬𝐬 didn't know the answer to when he first thought about it. It was hard to pinpoint the exact place where it all went wrong, since his life has always been wrong since he was 5. He had a good life. He had a loving mom, a best friend, a roof over his head, and he was a smart kid without the use of any quirks. This was only for the first 5 years of his life though. Everything changed when his quirk appeared. When you live in a world where 80% of the population has some form of a superpower called a quirk, getting a quirk is one of the most important moments of your life. What your quirk is can determine so much about your future. For example, his best friend, Katsuki Bakugo, otherwise known as 𝐾𝐦, had a super powerful quirk. He had the ability to create explosions by using a nitroglycerin-like substance that sweats from the palms of his hands. He couldn't control it much at first, which caused 𝐬𝐬 to get some scars, but they figured it out and he now has amazing control over it. Due to how powerful his quirk is, he has the chance of becoming a strong hero. We're going to be the best heroes, 𝐬𝐬. We just have to wait until you get your quirk. Bakugo happily yelled the day he got his quirk. For a while, they were scared that 𝐬𝐬 wouldn't get a quirk. Being quirkless was something that no one thought about until it actually happened. In this world, it was one of the worst things that could happen. In a world that heavily relies on quirks, it's like you're behind in development, which isn't true. As horrible as being quirkless can be in this world, 𝐬𝐬 almost wished he was quirkless. That's how bad his quirk screwed up his life. What would have happened if he was quirkless? God, 𝐬𝐬 did not want to go down that rabbit hole. The day 𝐬𝐬's quirk came in was a strange day. He woke up with a strange itch but didn't think that much about it and went on normally with his day. He did his normal routine, waking up, going to the bathroom, getting dressed, and finally running out of his room to eat breakfast with his mom. He noticed how his mom seemed to have a strange aura around her. It felt like he was drawn to her, but he couldn't understand why. 𝐬𝐬 ignored it though. He left the house and continued normally with his morning. When the time came to cross the street, he held his mom's hand, and the second he made contact there was a tingly feeling that he felt, and then the aura went away. These strange auras carried on for the whole day, but with everyone it was different. He noticed that 𝐾𝐦's aura was very loud and explosive, like his quirk. "Why are you looking at me like that?" 𝐾𝐦 asked after noticing 𝐬𝐬 staring. 𝐬𝐬 simply shrugged. "You just feel different for some reason." "Different? Well, I didn't change. I think you need to get your eyes checked," 𝐾𝐦 said, pointing at his eye. "No, you don't look different, but you feel different," 𝐬𝐬 said, this time emphasizing feel. 𝐾𝐦 perked up. "Is it your quirk? Did you finally get your quirk? Oh my god. It's about time." 𝐬𝐬 smiled at his friend's excitement. "I'll ask mom to take me to a doctor after school. I don't know what it is, but if it is a quirk then the doctor will surely know," 𝐬𝐬 said, matching his friend's excitement, but some nerves were there as well. The rest of the day 𝐬𝐬 was trying to figure out the different feelings. The soft, loud, safe, cold, warm, and energetic ones. He had no idea what they meant, but he figured that a doctor would know, so he waited as patiently as he could. He felt the tingling feeling that he felt with his mom 2 more times that day, and just like with his mom, both of the auras disappeared after he touched them. Looking back on it, he wished he noticed the confusion on his classmates' faces after he touched them. He can't blame himself though. He was 5 and hadn't learned how to pay attention to everything. That was a skill he learned not long later. After school, he told his mom about the strange feelings and she was able to get him into a quirk specialist the same day. This was the moment when his life began to plummet so far that he thinks it reached hell. The ability to take other people's quirks. That was his quirk. He currently had 3, his mom's quirk, a healing quirk, and a force field quirk. 3 quirks to match up with the 3 times he felt the strange tingle. It wasn't too hard for him to figure out how his quirk worked. On the car ride home, he thought about what he did each time he felt the tingle. He knew that it must have been activated through touch because if it wasn't, then he figured that many other people would have lost their quirks. The problem with that was that he touched 𝐀𝐦 many times and he still had his quirk, which brought him to his current theory, skin-to-skin contact. He held his mom's hand. He grabbed the little girl's exposed wrist to pull her through the crowd so she could play with them, and then he held the boy's hand to help him get up after falling. Those were the only times he made contact with someone and he wasn't blocked by a layer of clothing. He was silent from the time they got into the car until the 𝗵𝘃𝗟 came over for dinner that night. His mom talked to 𝐀𝐦's parents while 𝐀𝐦 went into his room. So, he started, seeming to notice how upset 𝐬𝐸 was. "What's your quirk?" 𝐬𝐸 buried his face in his pillow. "You're gonna hate me." 𝐀𝐦 scoffed. "What quirk could possibly make me hate you?" "One that's like a villain," 𝐬𝐸 replied, his words muffled by the pillow. There was silence between them before 𝐀𝐦 spoke up again. "So are you ever going to tell me what it is?" 𝐬𝐸 looked up from the pillow and stared at his best friend. He couldn't tell what he was thinking from his face, but he knew it wasn't anything bad. I can take other people's quirks," he muttered softly, but 𝐀𝐦 still heard it. His eyes went wide. "Like, take as in steal. Like they don't have it anymore, but you do." 𝐬𝐸 only nodded. "Well, it's not like you did it on purpose," he said, suddenly gaining a look of determination. I had many times where I lost control of my quirk. This isn't any different. It just has different consequences." 𝐬𝐸 hummed and looked back down at the pillow. In a way, he believed his friend, but a part of his mind told him that he could never be a hero with a quirk like his. "We'll figure it out," 𝐀𝐦 confidently said. "We will figure it out together like we did with my quirk and then become the greatest heroes of all time." 𝐬𝐸 got cut off before he could even start his sentence. "And if anyone tells you otherwise, then you don't listen to them because it's not true. If they call you a villain, it is because they don't know you. I don't think you could ever be a villain. You're too nice." 𝐬𝐸 smiled down at the pillow. It wasn't like he had to take any more quirks. He could just use the 3 that he already had and then forget all about his real quirk. After 𝐀𝐦's little pep talk, the 2 families ate dinner and then they left to go back to their own house. When 𝐬𝐸 and his mom were left alone, 𝐬𝐸 kept trying to give his mom's quirk back. "It's okay, 𝐬𝐸, I don't need my quirk back and I'm not upset at you. Everything will be okay, I promise." That was the understatement of the century. 𝐬𝐸 still wishes he remembered more about his mother. He can only remember small moments in the day he got his quirk, which was also the day she died. This part he remembers so clearly it was like it happened yesterday. 𝐬𝐸 couldn't sleep. He couldn't after the events of that day. He was sitting cross-cross on his bed with a notebook, writing ideas about how he could control his quirk when he felt a strange presence. It was a strong and dangerous presence that seemed to be close, too close to just be a neighbor coming home late. He noticed that there was a creak of what sounded like a door, but he hoped that it was just his mom getting up to use the bathroom, but some instinct told him that it wasn't her. Suddenly, he heard his mom scream and a loud crash noise. 𝐬𝐸 froze and shakily got up from his bed and made his way to the door. He still felt the presence close by, so he waited in his room with a shaky hand placed on the door until he felt the presence leave. 𝐬𝐸 slowly opened the door, wincing at the creak it made. "Mom," he called out, hoping for an answer. He never got one. "Mama," he called, his voice starting to crack. He walked over to her room and peeked inside. She was lying face down on the floor, blood pooling around her, and shattered glass from a vase was on the floor. "Mama," he cried and ran over to her. 𝐬𝐸 tried to use the healing quirk that he knew he had, but it wouldn't work. No matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't work. "Mama," he shook her to try to get some sort of reaction, but she just flopped back down. 𝐬𝐸 looked down at the blood that was now on his hands from touching her. His hands shook with a mix of fear and he began to hyperventilate from crying and panicking. He looked away from his mom at the sense of someone powerful outside the front door. This person was different from the last one though. While this person was powerful, he had many different auras. Until now, 𝐬𝐸 had only felt one aura come from one person. He heard the front door open and loud heavy footsteps started to walk down the hallway. 𝐬𝐸 kept close to his mother and held her bloody hand as if it would protect him. The man who walked into the room was pretty tall. He had bushy white hair and was wearing a suit. He looked down briefly at 𝐬𝐸's mom and sighed. "Now this is tragic, isn't it?" he said with fake sadness. "Who are you?" 𝐬𝐸 asked, trembling as he moved closer to his mother and held her hand tighter. The man smiled. "I'm your father. Don't you recognize me, 𝐬𝐸?" 𝐬𝐸 wished he didn't. If he didn't, then maybe he would have ran away, but he didn't run because now that he was looking at him closely, he did recognize the man. He saw this man in pictures that his mom showed him, One of those pictures was on the dresser near the door. Izuku focused on his aura, realizing that it must be similar to his own. The many different auras were from the hundreds of quirks that he had, that he must have stolen. If you come with me, I can protect you. He walked closer to Izuku. But what about Mama? He asked. The man, Izuku's father, just sighed. Not all men are created equal, Izuku. Izuku loosened his grip on his mother's hand in confusion. What? Izuku's father crouched down to Izuku's height. Some people are created to be small and tiny, but he held a hand out to Izuku. People like us were meant to be something big. What about Mama? He asked again, looking down at his father's large hand. His father scoffed. Your mother isn't like us. She wasn't strong like us. Izuku sniffled. He had never stopped crying, but it was to the point where he wasn't making any noise. There were only tears pouring down his face. I can help you. He moved the hand closer to Izuku. You can't learn how to properly use your quirk without me. Do you want to hurt people? Izuku shook his head, sniffling as more tears fell down his face, and no, he could have figured it out on his own. Between him and 𝐀𝐦, they would have figured it out. 𝐀𝐦 was too stubborn to not figure it out. He said it himself that day. He could have grown up normally, could have gone to UA with his best friend, and could have had a normal life. That life got ripped away from him the moment his mom died and his dad waltzed into his life. Aunt Mitsuki and Uncle Masaru would have taken good care of him. That much he knows from experience. He didn't need his father in his life. Nothing works out how you want it to though, especially when you're 5 and are knelt next to your dead mother, holding her blood-covered hand. Take my hand, Izuku. I promise I will protect you, my son. Empty promises. Maybe this was Izuku's first true mistake, taking the hand. Although, he could also blame that on being young and naive. He's starting to notice a trend with that. Izuku carefully let go of his mother's hand and reached out his hand, shaking more than he was before at the sight of his mother's blood coating his hand and dripping down his arm. His father grabbed his hand and smiled, seeming not to care about the blood coating his hand. I'm glad you trust me, Izuku, he said with a cruel smile. God, he wished he hadn't trusted him. The rest of the night was a blur. Izuku knew that police came in to question them and paramedics took away his mother under a white sheet, but he didn't remember it clearly. At some point, they washed his hands and arms, but he doesn't remember that. Maybe he doesn't remember it because he never felt like the blood was truly gone. He remembers being taken to his room and being told to take whatever was necessary. The necessary things were just his clothes, his notebook, and a picture of him and his mom that he was able to sneak into the bottom of the bag. At some point, 𝐾𝐦 and his mom came over when they found out what happened. Izuku didn't remember much about what happened here either. All he remembers was watching Aunt Mitsuki cry to his father. You're going away. Why? 𝐾𝐦 asked, trying not to cry. The two of them were inseparable. The only time one was seen without the other was when they were at their own homes. Even then, most of the time one was over the other's house. Izuku shrugged. I dunno, I just have to. He didn't even hear the part where he was moving somewhere new. The idea of that scares him, but he knows he didn't have a choice. Izuku got a hug from the two of them and his father took him on a walk down the street. Once 𝐾𝐦 and Aunt Mitsuki were out of view, they turned down a random alleyway and Izuku got picked up by his father. 𝐾𝐦, his father called out, take us home. A purple and black portal opened. His father walked through the portal. The other side looked like those bars that Izuku always saw on TV. There were two other people in the room. One whose head and arms were made of the same purple and black mist that the portal was made of. The man had a strange aura to him. It was all over the place. The other person was a kid who looked around 10 years old. He had shaggy light blue hair and red eyes. Izuku noticed how he was wearing white gloves on his hands. The boy had a destructive aura to him. Who's this? The boy asked, spinning to face them on the bar stool he was sitting on. This is Izuku. He's your brother, father said to the boy, setting Izuku down on the floor. The boy tilted his head. I have a brother. Father nodded. Yes, you better be nice to him. Izuku found out that the mist man was named 𝐾𝐦 and that his quirk was called Warp Gate. His quirk allowed him to create a warp gate to travel through. Izuku wasn't told much about how it works. That was all he was told. 𝐾𝐦 was always pretty tame. He followed whatever father wanted him to do with little to no complaint. When he wasn't doing villain work, he was basically babysitting Izuku and Tamura. The boy was named Tamura. His quirk was called Decay and let him turn whatever he touched with 5 fingers to dust. Tamura was always either calm or angry and destroying everything with his path. There seemed to be no in between. Father had always pushed him to destroy the things he hated and fueled his anger. Other than when Tamura was turning things to dust, he was pretty fun to hang out with. He liked to play video games during his free time. Izuku would often be found in Tamura's room playing some random video game with him. When Izuku wasn't with Tamura, he was most likely in the lab with his father, either testing out new quirks or watching experiments. It was here that he found out who his father truly was. His father was a villain called All-For-One who has been around since quirks existed. All-For-One stayed alive for so long from the number of quirks that he had that would keep him alive. He also found out what All for One's goal was. "You and I will do great things together, my boy, and it starts with killing All Might and taking back One for All." One for All was his uncle's quirk. Well, it wasn't really his quirk, but it stemmed from his quirk. His uncle had tried to use the quirk he originally had and the quirk that his father gave to him to put an end to his father's reign, but it didn't work. He ended up passing it on to other people, and this happened throughout 7 more generations. "See, you're my son 𝐬𝐸, which means you're my heir, my successor. I want you to get One for All, to be more powerful than I am. Then we can rule the world together." 𝐬𝐸 never felt special though, he just felt like a vessel. He had to spend the next 7 years of his life in that warehouse, training to become his father's secret weapon. He would get presented a person who most of the time would be knocked out, but there were some unfortunate times when they weren't. "What is their quirk, 𝐬𝐸?" 𝐬𝐸 hummed and focused. He had trained his quirk enough that auras turned into quirk signatures. At this point, it's second nature to detect what a quirk is and how powerful it is just from what the signature was and where it was. It's some sort of enhancement quirk. The power seems more near the legs, so I would say either enhanced speed or jump. Seems pretty low level, but still can be powerful. All for One nodded in approval. "Good job. It's a speed quirk. A low level one, but it would still work well for you." 𝐬𝐸 tried to not flinch when his father put a hand on his shoulder. "I want you to try to mix my power with your mother's power together again. If we can find a way to let you take quirks from a distance, then we will be unstoppable." 𝐬𝐸 nodded and held his hand out, feeling the powers swirl together and wrap around the person's quirk. He then pulled it to him, feeling the power of the speed quirk wrap around his legs. All for One smiled. "Good." He put his hand in 𝐬𝐸's hair, giving it a small ruffle. That's how it went. He would bring in someone new and ask 𝐬𝐸 to identify the quirk. Then, he would either make 𝐬𝐸 take the quirk or save it for the Namu project. When he turned 12, he finally had enough. He decided that he was going to leave. His last straw was when he was forced to take a teleportation quirk from a 6-year-old girl. All the other people were adults who mostly didn't use their quirks, so 𝐬𝐸 felt less guilty. The girl was awake when it happened, which enraged 𝐬𝐸. He ran once when he was 9 but got caught easily. His memory was erased after, so he didn't know what happened until he got a lecture from All for One. He was more trained now though, he wouldn't get caught this time. "𝐬𝐸 Shigaraki, whatever you're about to do, I'd advise against it." 𝐬𝐸 glared at Kurogiri. "You don't know what I'm about to do." Tamura sat on the farthest stool, quietly messing with his glove. Kurogiri stood emotionless between 𝐬𝐸 and the door like that could stop him. 𝐬𝐸 huffed and focused on thinking of a plan. The way the teleportation quirk worked was by saving points to teleport to. It wasn't a free-range quirk like Kurogiri's, which meant that it was completely useless to him right now. He knew he had to have a quirk that would help him in this situation. He and probably around 100 by this point. "Young master." "What?" 𝐬𝐸 snapped. "Why don't you calm down and think about this rationally?" Kurogiri suggested. "I am thinking about this rationally," 𝐬𝐸 shouted. Tamura sat in the back, watching intently but keeping out of it. Tamura was very argumentative, but he was usually quiet when the argument didn't involve him, especially when the argument involved an angry 𝐬𝐸. You didn't want to mess with an angry 𝐬𝐸. They had tried to stop him, but it didn't work. He took some of his items, using a quirk that allowed him to store items like an inventory in a game, and burnt down the warehouse using one of the first quirks he got, which just so happened to be a fire quirk. Kurogiri couldn't get him because he made himself invisible using a quirk he calls cloak. Maybe this was another mistake. Running away. If he stayed, then maybe he could have stopped them from doing what they did. If he didn't run, then maybe All for One wouldn't have pushed Tamura to insanity. Tamura was always a bit insane, but it was manageable. He was still a person with morals. All for One took that away from him. If 𝐬𝐸 stayed, then maybe the outcome would have been different. There was no changing that now. All he could do was look back on it, which doesn't do much. He wandered the streets until he found a train station. Musutafu was a name that he was surprised he remembered after all that time away from home. He used cloak to sneak into the station and onto the next train to Masutafu. He got off the train and wandered around the city for a while, keeping cloak activated so he didn't attract the attention of heroes. It would be suspicious to see a 12-year-old child wandering the streets alone so late at night. Everything around him has a sense of nostalgia while also being painfully unfamiliar. He walked around until he found the warehouse district. It wasn't anything special. It was just a bunch of abandoned warehouses that were destroyed in an attack before he was even born. Many of the buildings were unstable, so they were all abandoned. In 𝐬𝐸's opinion, they were perfect to hide out in. He had vague memories of him and 𝐀𝐦 running around the district one day and then getting scolded by their parents for going into the district. He turned off the cloaking quirk and wandered around the district, trying to find a stable place to start living. He made it to the middle of the district when he found a warehouse that seemed untouched. The only problem was that the door was blocked because of debris. This was a simple solution though. He just had to jump through a window. The place was dusty, but other than that, there was nothing wrong with it. He found many furniture items that were thrown out that were in pretty good condition. He mostly lived on using his inventory quirk to steal food and clothing from big brand stores that he knew could handle losing a couple of food bars and a hoodie. He also started vigilantism around this time. He realized a couple of weeks in that he had nothing to do and that wandering the streets aimlessly would only keep him entertained for so long. He decided to become a vigilante when he began to realize how bad the crime rate was around the shopping district. Izuku had always wanted to be a hero, but he had assumed that after all he's been through that it wasn't possible anymore. He realized a few weeks into freedom that even though he may not be able to legally become a hero, he could still save people. He ended up going to a thrift store to find something to wear while out and grabbed a green hoodie and a pair of black cargo pants. What he didn't realize was that the hoodie he stole had a pair of green bunny ears attached to it. He didn't mind though, he thought they were cute. He also grabbed a black beanie to cover his hair and a pair of black gloves so that he knew for sure that he wouldn't accidentally use his birth quirk. It didn't take long for him to get settled into a patrol routine. He already knew how to fight, so all he needed to do was figure out what quirks to use. He decided to use the teleportation quirk and his cloak quirk since those would be best to sneak around with. He also used something that he called Boost, just a bunch of enhancement quirks that he grouped together to make one quirk. For the next year, he made a name for himself as Rabbit. Not a name he chose, but it was fitting, so he allowed it. He patrolled from sunset to sunrise, using his teleportation quirk to teleport to the start of his patrol and then using it again to simply teleport home. During the day, he would either sleep or work on some support item. He needed a hobby, so he ended up picking up coding and building so he could create himself support items. About 2 years into being a vigilante, he found out about the underground, a place for vigilantes and low-level criminals to hang out and a place where they can find jobs, create allies, and buy gear and other things. Some shops sold weapons, and he even found a place that sold contact lenses, so after a few jobs, he was able to find a pair of contact lenses that turned his green eyes red and the yellow circles in his eyes from a quirk black. Izuku was 14 when he found 𝐀𝐦 again. It was one of the days where Izuku couldn't sleep, so he ended up walking around to try to get some energy out when the two of them spotted each other from across the street. That reunion had been emotional for the both of them, and Izuku ended up teleporting them back to the warehouse so they could talk in private. Izuku had no problem telling him about what the past 9 years of his life had been like. They ended up telling Aunt Mitsuki and Uncle Masaru that his dad had moved back to Japan for a bit but then got called back to America and figured Izuku was old enough to be left alone if given an allowance. Neither of them were happy to hear this, but they were understanding and allowed him to stay at their house as much as he wanted. He would usually go back to the warehouse while 𝐀𝐦 was in school, and then would go back to their house until 𝐀𝐦 went to bed and Izuku went on patrol. This worked for a year until Mitsuki pressured him to show her where he lived. He ended up breaking and telling her pretty much everything but leaving a lot of moments vague. She didn't take the news well, but her horror turned to pure anger. After her cursing out his father, she agreed to keep it to herself and she offered him a permanent home. They never bothered getting him back in school since he was so far ahead of his class. At that point, school would just be pointless. He was smart enough without intelligence quirks, but with the added intelligence quirks that he had, academics were too easy for him. Plus, he had gone through schooling while he was still with all for one and was at a college level before he left. Looking back at this, nothing stands out to him as a big mistake, but then his mind landed on the sludge villain incident. While the incident itself wasn't his fault, in all honesty, he wouldn't have been able to prevent the incident unless they took another way home or if one of them was quicker or slower leaving the school. The incident made his face public since he ran in to protect 𝐀𝐦. He feels like that was how they knew he was still out there. Izuku assumed that his father always knew he was out there, but this gave them a location and proof. He still needs to figure out how they knew about him being a vigilante. He searched his memories again, some of them beginning to fade as he started to revive, but he forced them to stay. Whoever was there waiting for him could wait a little while longer. Well, you're pretty tough to track down, aren't you? Izuku paused at the memory. Izuku would have frowned if he had a physical form. This was the first time he met Aizawa. He realized that here was where he made a mistake. He doesn't regret meeting Eraserhead. He regrets getting documented. Before, there wasn't much about him to get his father's attention, so he flew under his radar. When he started to get documented, though, too many keywords were used and his father must have caught on and decided that after knowing both of his identities, he could start all of this early. Father said you might be here. I guess he was right, as always. The voice fizzled out and the memory began to fade. I'm glad we did this early then. We could have missed our chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The sludge villain incident could have been the thing that caused the last year to happen. Izuku knows that it wasn't his fault, but he needed more time to look back. He made the memory go back to the start of the day. Could he have stopped this from happening? Izuku waited outside Aldria Junior High, watching as children left in their small groups. He did this every day and it got to the point where no one looked at him anymore. When he first started to do this a year ago, many people stared at him and there were even a few times when an adult would come out and question him. What are you doing here, young man? was usually close to the question they would ask him. "I'm meeting up with my friend," was usually how he would respond. "Shouldn't you be in school?" was always the follow-up question. "Oh, I'm homeschooled," was always the lie he told. Everyone eventually got used to his presence at the gate, and he just became the strange kid who hung out at the school entrance every day. He waited at the gate until he spotted 𝐀𝐦. It wasn't difficult to spot him. His hair was the thing that mostly gave it away since it was spiky and poking up in every direction. He had a permanent scowl on his face as he walked towards 𝐬𝐸. "Hey nerd," he greeted and walked past 𝐬𝐸 knowing that the boy would start following him. "Hey 𝐀𝐦, what did you do in school?" 𝐬𝐸 asked once he caught up to him and was right beside him. 𝐀𝐦 just shrugged. "Nothing much. We applied to high schools today, but honestly, nothing else happened. I'm the only one in my grade who's applying to UA though." He said the last part with a prideful smirk. 𝐬𝐸 just smiled. "Well, that's cool, right?" 𝐀𝐦 scoffed. "Yeah, I guess it's pretty cool, but I'm not surprised that I'm the only one who is applying since none of those extras stand a chance of getting into that school." 𝐬𝐸 just rolled his eyes, already used to this speech. "And you know what would make going to UA even better?" 𝐀𝐦 asked, glancing down at 𝐬𝐸. "What?" 𝐬𝐸 asked, looking up at 𝐀𝐦. "You applying with me?" 𝐬𝐸 sighed. 𝐀𝐦 has been pressuring 𝐬𝐸 to apply to UA since his teachers talked to the class about applying to high schools. "𝐀𝐦, you know why I can't do that?" 𝐬𝐸's eyes narrowed, but 𝐀𝐦 didn't let up. "You said it yourself that he could never get into the UA system. You'd be safe there and you could become a legal hero." The two of them turned down an alleyway that was a direct cut through to a shopping district. "You don't think I've given up on wanting to become a hero duo, right?" 𝐬𝐸 went to say something when he felt his quirk ping at someone below them rushing toward where they were standing. 𝐀𝐦 must have realized that 𝐬𝐸 felt something because he got into a defensive stance. Before 𝐬𝐸 could read the quirk or warn 𝐀𝐦, the sewer cap between them rattled and shot up. The thing that shot up looked like it was just a blob of sewage. The only things that made it semi-human were the two large eyes and a mouth. "What the fuck is that?" 𝐀𝐦 shouted with horror. 𝐬𝐸 stood there in horror trying to read this guy's quirk. He'd never seen or felt anything like it, which is probably why he's having a hard time reading it. All he could tell about the quirk was that it was mutant-based, water-based, and it had some sort of control factor. The thing that concerned him the most was the control factor because that could mean several things. The sludgeman laughed at the two of them and a sick smile came across his face. Well, I didn't expect two people to be in this alleyway. Oh well, I can handle myself against some dumb middle schoolers." 𝐬𝐸 tried to rush forward and grab 𝐀𝐦, but the sludge covered up his path. Before 𝐬𝐸 could try again, the villain smacked 𝐬𝐸 away hard enough that he hit the wall. "It would be nice to take both of you, but I only need one skin suit to get out of here." 𝐬𝐸 froze at the words of the villain. He looked up and saw the sludge surrounding 𝐀𝐦. 𝐬𝐸 didn't know the villain's plan or why he was doing this, but the way that 𝐀𝐦 struggled against the quirk didn't sit right with him. In only a few seconds the quirk had spread to his hands and the sludge took the form of a hand and began to release large explosions. 𝐬𝐸 cursed and jumped back to not get hit by the explosions. He was backed into a corner both literally and figuratively. 𝐬𝐸 knew he could use a quirk to defeat the villain, but with all of the explosions nearby, there are probably a couple of heroes on their way as he sits and thinks. If he got caught, then he could get charged with vigilantism, and he preferred to not get charged with vigilantism while he isn't being a vigilante. He also was literally backed into the corner of the alleyway, so he couldn't have much room to do anything even if he wanted to. "This is some power you got here, kid. I could easily use it to get the hell out of here." The villain laughed and began to move out of the alleyway. 𝐬𝐸 couldn't let that happen though. He needed something to attack with. He didn't keep any knives with him, which he would need to change after this. He didn't have anything to protect himself, but with all of the explosions going on, there would be some debris that he could chuck at the guy. The sludge villain ran out into the street and 𝐬𝐸 heard screaming. He glanced down at the leftover debris that was now unguarded and wasted no time running to the baseball-sized ones and storing them all away using his storage quirk. He quickly turned to the street but paused at the condition of it. The first thing he noticed was the fire that covered everything. It was only getting worse with the explosions that were now larger and more powerful than the ones from before. The second thing he noticed were the quirks of some heroes that were on the scene. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. 𝐀𝐦 was still struggling against the villain, but it seemed to get him nowhere. 𝐬𝐸 pulled back his arm and chucked the rock at the sludge. The villain grunted in pain and turned to look at 𝐬𝐸 with crazy eyes. 𝐬𝐸 summoned another rock that he stored. "Let him go," he said with a glare, and then threw the rock at the villain's eye. 𝐬𝐸 summoned another one and went to throw it, but he was yanked back by a giant vine. He didn't even realize that 𝐀𝐦 Woods was right behind him. "Come on, kid, let's get you to safety," the hero said, pulling 𝐬𝐸 to the barrier at the end of the street. 𝐬𝐸 let out a sigh of relief. Heroes were here, which meant that 𝐀𝐦 was safe from the sludge villain. 𝐀𝐦 Woods dropped him behind the barrier and began to ask him questions. "Is that boy your friend?" 𝐬𝐸 nodded. "We were walking home from school. And the villain came out from a sewer cap and began talking about using him as a skin suit, Izuku explained. He looked back at the scene in front of him and quickly realized that no heroes were on the scene. Well, there were 4 of them behind the barrier trying to keep civilians safe, but none of them were out there helping 𝐀𝐻. Izuku turned back to the hero. Why is no one helping him? His voice was surprisingly small and he sounded like a scared kid. In a way, he was a scared kid. None of us have the right quirk to take this on. We're waiting for backup and saving the people we can. This answer made Izuku mad and he didn't try to hide it. Even though Izuku didn't agree with his father and brother about hero society, there were a few things that he had an issue with. One of those things being the over-reliance on quirks. A child was dying right now and no one was even attempting anything because their quirk isn't the right fit. Izuku could think of a million ways that these heroes could at least attempt to help, but they're not doing anything. Izuku gritted his teeth and glared at the hero. So you're just going to let him die? He shouted, his voice slightly cracking. This was his best friend that he was talking about. He wasn't keen on watching his best friend die. We don't want him to die, but there is nothing we can do right now, the hero tried to reason. Bullshit, Izuku shouted and 𝐀𝐻 Woods jumped back a bit. Calm down, kid. You're losing control over your quirk, the hero said in a calming tone but made no move to get anywhere near Izuku. Izuku stepped back in fear at the comment but calmed down when he saw the flames that followed his movement. He took a deep breath to calm himself. He didn't want to draw the fire over to all the civilians. He was scared that his birth quirk had gone off while he was panicking, but it was instead his pyrokinesis. Pyrokinesis was the first and one of the only powerful and flashy quirks that he took. As a kid, he had always assumed that his quirk would be pyrokinesis because, at that point in his life, it was what made sense. His mother had weak telekinesis and his father had fire breathing. Mix those two and you get pyrokinesis. It was given to him as a gift very early on in his stay with All for One so that his wishes would come true. Izuku had great control over the quirk since his father wanted that to be one of the main quirks that he used, but after not using it for 3 years, he seemed to have lost control over it. He waved his hand to get rid of the fire. Sorry about that. Got too mad, he muttered, glaring to the side. The hero began to speak again, but Izuku tuned him out as an idea came into his head. No one was doing anything to save 𝐀𝐻, who at this point was barely even struggling against the villain. It would be difficult for someone to go to the scene because of all the fire, but he wasn't affected by the fire. Sure, using your quirk to save others without the proper license was illegal, but that hasn't stopped him for the past 3 years. Why should he start caring now, especially when he would be the only one to do something? He worried about it earlier, but that was before 𝐀𝐻 was about to die and no one was even making an attempt to help. 𝐀𝐻 Woods tried to lead him over to an ambulance to get checked out, but Izuku didn't give him a chance to move him away from the scene. Izuku broke out into a sprint before the hero could react and ran toward the sludge villain. He kept his pyrokinesis in his head so the fire would naturally move away from him. He remembered what he had done earlier and formed a ball of fire with his hands and threw it at the sludge villain's eye. If they thought his quirk had something to do with fire, then he would use that to his advantage. The eye he hit was the same eye that he threw a rocket, but this was a ball of fire, so the reaction was extremely different. The villain screamed a loud and painful screech. It may have hurt his ears, but it did what he wanted it to do. It made the villain let go of 𝐀𝐻 and give him a much-needed breath. He ran over to where 𝐀𝐻's head was now free and began to burn through the sludge to grab his hand. Izuku tried to pull him out, but he was too far in the sludge to be pulled easily. The sludge man groaned and formed a large hand. Heroes called out for someone to save Izuku and get him out of danger. Izuku knew he didn't need them. He could easily dodge the blow, but right before he could move, another strand of sludge latched onto his leg and held him in place. Well, shit, Izuku cursed to himself and shut his eyes, preparing for impact. However, the impact never came. It only took a solid 2 seconds for Izuku to know exactly who this was. The way his birth quirk screamed at him was a tell in itself. It was one for all. All Might out of all the people was here to save them. Izuku was thankful for this, but at the same time, he hated it. His quirk screamed around All Might's quirk, and he hated listening to the way his quirk hummed around it. He never experienced it before, but now he has, and he can say officially that he hates it. The euphoric feeling that came from the feel of the quirk was too addicting. It felt like he was an addict who was staring right at their addiction on a table in front of them. Nothing was stopping them from taking it, but they would need to suppress those urges. The urge may be too strong though, but Izuku has held back those urges his whole life. All Might punched through the sludge and grabbed 𝐀𝐻 and Izuku's wrists in the same hand and then punched away the sludge in one giant gust of wind. The wind died down and All Might gently put the two boys down. 𝐀𝐻 fell to the floor and coughed up some of the sludge. Izuku looked down at him with worry, but he could sense that his friend was physically all right. The fire that covered the street was now completely gone and Izuku had no idea where the villain went, but the good news was he was gone. A raindrop hit Izuku on his cheek, making him flinch. He looked up to the sky to see rain clouds start to surround him. All he could do was look up at the sky in shock. All Might had changed the weather. That was something that he didn't think the man could do. Heroes surrounded them. Some of them were scolding Izuku while the others were making sure that 𝐾𝐿 was okay, and the rest were looking for scattered blobs of sludge. Izuku wasn't even listening to what the heroes were saying. From what he gathered, it was mostly lecturing him on quirk use. Izuku was mostly focused on All Might, who was swarmed by reporters. He wasn't even listening to what he was saying. All he could hear was his quirk buzzing in his ear, itching for him to take. Izuku looked down at his hand and noticed that the bandages had burnt off. Izuku quickly shoved his hand in his pocket so that there would be some form of barrier between his quirk and All Might. In the end, they took 𝐾𝐿 to a hospital to get him checked out, but he was deemed physically okay. Auntie picked them up from the hospital and immediately crushed 𝐾𝐿 in a hug. "Let go of me, you old hag, I'm fine." 𝐾𝐿 weakly fought her hold. His voice was scratchy from the sludge. "Sorry for worrying about my son who just got attacked by a fucking villain." She shook his shoulders as if that would get 𝐾𝐿 to stop complaining. The three of them drove in silence, which was surprising considering that 𝐾𝐿 and his mother were in the same vicinity. It was sunset by the time they got home, which meant that it was almost time for Izuku to patrol. The two boys went upstairs and 𝐾𝐿 did his homework while Izuku read through the news to see other events. This is usually how it would go at night. 𝐾𝐿 focused on his homework and studying while Izuku focused on keeping himself busy. Izuku could tell that something was wrong with him though. He wasn't as focused, and Izuku could see it in his eyes. They were distant, like his mind was wandering. 𝐾𝐿's mind didn't wander often. Izuku didn't pry though. He's learned after all these years that prying would only make him shut himself in more. He knew that the sludge villain incident traumatized him, so Izuku needed him to open up at some point. He just hoped that would happen sooner rather than later. Izuku shut his laptop and announced that he was leaving for patrol, earning a nod and a small "don't die" from his friend. Izuku scoffed and used his quirk to teleport himself to the warehouse that he half lives in. It was a good warehouse considering the place it was in. It didn't have much in it besides some old furniture that he found on the side of the road and brought into the place. It was a large open room with a brown leather couch in the center with a green rug underneath it. There were two end tables on either side of the couch, one a light oak color while the other was white. He also had a coffee table that was dark wood. 𝐾𝐿 originally called the place an interior design nightmare. But Izuku didn't care. Sure, nothing matched, but he felt like it gave the place character. That could have also been an excuse, but he wouldn't think about that for too long. There was a sink in the corner that didn't work very well, so it was just a storage place for first aid stuff and spare fabric. There was a bathroom in the corner that surprisingly still worked, but it only had a toilet and a sink. He had a picture frame of him and 𝐾𝐿 as kids on one of the nightstands next to a light-up cat nightlight that he found in a dumpster. He grabbed his vigilante outfit that consisted of black cargo pants, a black beanie to cover his hair, black gloves, old dark red sneakers, red eye contacts, a black face mask with a built-in voice changer, and finally his signature green hoodie with a pair of floppy bunny ears. He didn't intentionally pick that hoodie, but the thought of a criminal getting beat by a child in a rabbit hoodie was a very funny thought at the time. It still is a funny thought, and it makes Izuku grin every time he thinks about it. He quickly threw his outfit on and grabbed the basket of knives he had. He had enough quirks to get by, but he liked to use his knives sometimes. He bought them from the underground about a year ago. He had two matching daggers with a green handle and a small rabbit face carved on the bottom corner of the two blades. Another thing he had was a retractable bow staff that was the same dark green as his knives. It was small enough to fit in his hand, but with the press of a button, he could extend it to the length of a regular bow staff. The bow staff has the same logo carved into it that the knives had. The only reason he got this was because he got into the habit of whacking people on the head with things, so he made it easier on himself and gave himself an object to have on him at all times. He put the two of them away in his storage quirk and checked that his hood was up before teleporting to his usual patrol start point. He shivered at the temperature difference before turning on cloak and making his way across the rooftops. He was never seen by anyone because he was usually invisible while he was walking around. It made it safer for him when no heroes could see where he was. The only time he turned off cloak was when no one was around. He only did this so he wouldn't get quirk exhaustion for using his quirk for hours straight. When he was out as Rabbit, his quirk was teleportation. He wasn't sure how the police thought his quirk worked or even if they knew what it was, but what he did know was that nothing was official when it came to him. All they knew was that he was a vigilante with a great capture rate and the ability to teleport. He leaped across the rooftops and used his birth quirk to search for quirks. As much as he hated using his birth quirk, if he could use it for good then he would. He would never use his birth quirk to its full extent. That was a promise he made to himself a long time ago. He leaped across rooftops in search of any crime and made his way to where there were quirk signatures in strange areas. Usually, this would lead him to crimes that are either going on or just about to start. He now could make it so quirk signatures showed up as small dots. It was something that he had trained himself to see while he was with All for One. It started happening when he began to merge his parents' quirks. If you're going to take a quirk from afar, then you'll need to see what you're taking. He could toggle on and off this part of his quirk so that his vision wouldn't be blocked by it. One of the most important parts of this ability is that he can tell when a quirk is being used. The small dot that he sees lights up, which is important since citizens can't use their quirks legally in public. Combine a suspicious location with the lit-up quirk signatures and you've got yourself a crime to stop. It didn't take long for a dot to spike up not too far from where he was. He quickly changed his direction and ran toward the dot, which was on the far side of an alleyway. It didn't take long for a scream to echo through the buildings. Izuku made it to the alleyway and turned off the dots. There were 2 kids in the corner of the alley. The 2 of them had strong quirks, but he only focused on what they were for a short time. He couldn't rely on civilian quirks. The man, on the other hand, had some quirk that allowed him to stretch his limbs. My, you kids got some good quirks there. The villain cooed at the kids. One of his arms elongated and reached for one of the kids. Izuku took that as his cue to step in. He summoned his retractable bow staff and elongated it before jumping down between the villain and the kids, smacking away the arm with the staff and then putting it away so his hands were free. The villain hissed in pain and retracted his arm to a normal length. "That fucking hurt," he complained while shaking his hand. Izuku glanced behind him at the kids. They probably weren't older than 9. "I need you 2 to trust me, okay?" he said in a soft voice. The 2 of them nodded quickly in fear. Izuku activated his teleporting quirk, which caused his hand to glow a light green color. He needed to get the kids out of here and quickly. Teleporting was his best bet. The 2 of them reached their hand out hesitantly to touch his hand, but the villain stretched out an arm and to knock away Izuku, but he dodged the hand before it made contact. "You really think I would let you ruin my job that easily, you stupid vigilante?" The villain's arm followed Izuku's path, but he was quicker to dodge. Izuku quickly turned himself invisible and ducked under the arm. He needed to get the kids out of the alley. It was too cramped, and Izuku feared that the 2 of them would be caught in the crossfire. The villain's quirk made it easy to scoop up the kids and run. From what he was saying, Izuku figured that the villain wanted the kid. The villain paused and looked around the alley and laughed. "Coward. He couldn't even stay long enough to protect you," he said with a sick laugh. The kids shrunk back further into the corner and made a squeak of fear. Before the villain could make another move, Izuku ran to them and readied his teleportation. Once he was between the villain and the kids, he let down the invisibility. The villain grunted in surprise and the kids gasped. The villain jumped back and Izuku put his hand on one of them, watching as the green glow surrounded the 2 of them. "I'm going to teleport you to the police station. Go get help," he quickly ordered and focused on the mark that he had in front of the police station. The 2 nodded and Izuku completed the teleportation. The villain cursed, "Are you fucking kidding me? I worked so hard to get those kids in a corner. Stupid helicopter parents, they never make an opening." He reached out both of his hands this time, trying to capture Izuku in between them. Izuku jumped up and just barely avoided the hands. He quickly bounced off the wall and kicked the villain in the head. The villain fell to the ground and was knocked out. It was strange how easily the villain got taken out, but it seemed like he didn't have much fighting experience, only using brute force and stealth to get his way. Izuku also assumed that he mostly targeted kids who couldn't fight back, so it was always an easy win for him. Izuku summoned some heavy-duty rope and secured his hands and feet together in a way that he wouldn't be able to move even if he woke up and tried to use his quirk. He stepped away from the villain and pulled out a phone, dialing the only number he had in the burner phone. It rang for a couple of seconds before a familiar and tired voice picked up. "Hello," the tired voice of Detective Tsukachi said from the phone. "Tsukachi," he happily chirped. There was a sigh from the other end of the line. "Hello, Rabbit," the man tiredly greeted. "We found the kids you saved." Izuku softly smiled to himself. "Well, that's good. I don't know what was going on, but it seemed like a trafficking situation." When he thought about it, the kids had pretty strong quirks, and from what the man was saying, talking about waiting for an opening and things like that, it was obvious that those kids were being trafficked somehow. That was a problem in many areas, quirk trafficking. When he first heard about it, he worried that it was his father, but it just seemed like there were other assholes out there in the world. He's taken down some of the rings and areas before. Most of the time he accidentally stumbled upon them and would quickly teleport everyone out of there and burn down the building. Most of the places were just old abandoned areas, so he would just get rid of them. He didn't want to risk anyone else coming back and starting another ring. Izuku told the detective his location and quickly hung up the phone. He grabbed the villain and dragged him to the street and teleported to a spot on the roof where he could watch over the villain. He turned on cloak when he heard sirens approaching his location. He watched as the police put the villain in a van and drove off with him. The detective stayed around for a bit longer to scout the scene, and Izuku assumed that he was also searching for him as well. Not that the man would find him, but it was entertaining to watch him search the rooftops and look straight at him before leaving the scene. Once Izuku couldn't hear the sirens anymore, he checked around him for any close quirk signatures. He released cloak when he didn't feel any presence near him. He stood up from his crouched position but paused when he realized he couldn't feel the buzzing of his quirk anymore. Before Izuku could realize what was going on, White bindings went around his waist and secured his arms to his side, making it so he couldn't move. It didn't take long for Izuku to realize that he was fucked. A man was standing next to a large air conditioning unit. He was wearing all black and had a white scarf-looking thing around his neck. The man's black hair was floating around him and he had yellow goggles that covered his eyes. Izuku realized that this was Eraserhead, an underground pro hero with the ability to erase quirks. He was stuck in the hero's capture weapon with no quirk, meaning that he couldn't escape. Shit, he cursed to himself. He did his research on every single pro who patrolled around here, and Eraserhead was not on the list. Well, you're tough to track down, aren't you? The man said in a tired but prideful voice. Well, when you're someone like me, being tough to track down is a great skill to have, Izuku shot back, glaring at the hero. Someone like you? The hero asked, stepping closer to Izuku. Yeah, someone like me. Someone who is sorta, illegal. Izuku was just trying to stall by sassing the man. Usually, heroes get confused when met with sass because they're used to people either being scared, rude, or egotistical. When met with a sassy child, they usually mess up on something and it lets Izuku get away. Eraserhead didn't seem to care about this though, but it still was a stalling tactic. The hero hummed, so you know what you're doing is illegal. Izuku scoffed. Duh, I'm not a stupid child, he replied with more hostility than he meant to. He mentally shrugged. Oh well. He didn't know how Eraserhead's quirk worked and that was an issue. He needed to find his weakness and he thinks he already found it. For a split second, his hair that floated around him fell. It was only a second, but for that second Izuku felt the buzz of his quirk come back. Once his hair went up again, the buzz went away. Eraserhead's quirk worked with his eyes. That's why he wore goggles, to block the obvious signs of his quirk use. His hair though was another sign, one that many people would not notice unless they were really paying attention. Izuku smirked, thankful that it was covered by his mask. He had an out, a way he could escape. It was all about timing. He needed to be quick and teleport away the second that his quirk turned off. Well, that was easy to figure out, maybe a little too easy. The hero sighed. You know, I'm not here to arrest you, I just needed to talk to you. Izuku paused for a second to think. If he wanted to arrest him then he probably would have done it already, but this could also be Eraserhead trying to make him let his guard down. Yeah, okay, you want to talk. He rolled his eyes but kept his eye on the hero's hair, waiting for the opportunity to get out. The hero stood his ground. I'm being serious. You have information that I need and then you're free to go. Izuku raised an eyebrow at the man, choosing to ignore the last part for now. And what information could I possibly have for you? He asked in a sassy tone. You've been taking down trafficking rings. The hero said like it was news to Izuku. Yeah, what about it? I'm sorta doing that on purpose, you know. Izuku attempted to shrug but it didn't work out well since his arms were pinned to his side. You got a problem with that? I don't have a problem with you taking down the rings, Eraserhead said with a sigh. I have an issue with you burning it down and getting rid of our evidence. Izuku looked down at the floor, disappointed that he didn't even think about the evidence at those places. Oh, he muttered. Don't worry about it. The hero blinked but Izuku didn't try to get away. He figured that he would have another opportunity, plus he was curious. Eraserhead could have done this in an interrogation room, but instead, he was doing it on a rooftop 6 feet away from him. He wanted something, and Izuku was curious about what he wanted. You're young, aren't you? It wasn't a question, more like he was stating it. Izuku failed to shrug. What if I am? Then why aren't you in a hero school? Eraserhead asked. You're good at this stuff from what I see. You'd make a great hero if you'd get your license and go through the necessary training. Izuku looked back up at the hero. Reasons? Eraserhead sighed. That's not an answer, kid. I'm not obligated to answer your dumb questions, he said with a glare. Well, you answered one of them, Eraserhead pointed out. Exactly, he said, not knowing what else to say. Eraserhead opened his mouth to say something but Izuku interrupted him. So, you never got to doing the thing that isn't arresting me. Izuku changed the subject. Eraserhead sighed and dropped his quirk but Izuku could tell that he was ready to reactivate it if Izuku tried to make a move. You're good at this stuff, taking down the trafficking rings and all that. Izuku didn't try to escape. He wanted to hear Eraserhead out. Now that he let go of his quirk, Izuku could escape at any time. He wasn't too worried. Yeah, I guess I am. Why are you bringing this up? He felt like Eraserhead was trying to dance around something. Because we need help with this case and you have information for us. I'd like it if you would team up with me to help put together this case. He finally explained, but it only brought up more questions. Why would you need to team up with a vigilante? Also, what would you need to put together? He asked, not being afraid to ask questions because what he was asking Izuku to do was weird. What would Eraserhead need from Izuku? We think that most of the rings are connected somehow. We just don't know how, Eraserhead began. You're a smart kid. And you should have enough knowledge from the many rings that you've taken down to be a valuable asset in this investigation. Izuku hummed and thought about it for a moment. It was risky to team up with a hero, especially one who was able to get rid of Izuku's quirk. That wouldn't normally be an issue, but for some reason, he can't detect Eraserhead's quirk. He assumed that it was because of the nature of the quirk, but it was something that put him on edge. 𝐻𝐸 couldn't see Eraserhead coming if he chose to sneak up on him. He assumed that he would be able to see his quirk, but he wouldn't be able to turn on the dots without alerting Eraserhead. When he turned on the dots, his eyes would glow a bit. He wasn't sure why, but if Eraserhead saw this, then he would turn back on his quirk. Alright then, you want to team up, then so be it. I'm willing to do it, but if I find out that there's an alternate motive, then I am out of this little deal, he said firmly, making no room to argue. Eraserhead released the bindings. Alright then, sounds good to me. 𝐻𝐸 nodded and stood up. Alright then, see you around, I guess. 𝐻𝐸 waved and turned on Cloak before Eraserhead would erase his quirk. He cloaked himself to make sure that Eraserhead wasn't bluffing about anything he said. The hero stood there for a second, staring at the spot that 𝐻𝐸 previously stood at. His spacing out got interrupted by his phone ringing, which he quickly took out of his pocket and answered. "Hey, 𝗀𝐿, he greeted. There was some silence where 𝐻𝐸 assumed the detective was speaking. He wasn't able to hear the detective, so he would be getting a one-sided, but he would live. Oh, I actually just talked to him. I told him about our plan and him being a part of it. It was very vague, which wasn't intended, but he surprisingly agreed. Oh, so the detective must have known about Eraserhead's plan to meet him. He hoped that this whole thing wasn't connected to a case about trying to arrest him. He knows that's probably the case, but he didn't feel like dealing with that." Eraserhead looked out to the city, finally taking his eyes off the spot where 𝐻𝐸 was previously visible. Don't get your hopes up yet. He could always bail at any moment. Well, yeah, he could. He could have just said yes and then never seen the hero again. Something in 𝐻𝐸 told him that Eraserhead was serious about what he said. 𝐻𝐸 called it a gut feeling, and usually his gut was right. There still is a chance that his gut isn't right, and that is usually the bad outcome. 𝐻𝐸 needed to be prepared for the bad outcome, and if anything, he should expect it more. He can't go throwing his trust at everyone. Last time he truly trusted something, it really didn't work out well for him. Yeah, whatever. We'll have to see how this all works out. 𝐻𝐸 didn't know what that was about, but he could assume that he was talking about their plan on how to deal with Rabbit. Sounds like they're playing it by ear, which is an odd thing to do, but 𝐻𝐸 wasn't going to question that, for now. Eraserhead nodded at whatever the detective was saying on the phone. Yeah, I was planning on doing that anyway. I gotta continue my patrol, so I'll talk to you more at the station. Well, that phone call didn't reveal much. He was hoping for some top secret information, or maybe some "this trap is working and the idiot vigilante is falling for it" type stuff. It frustrated 𝐻𝐸 a bit to not have answers, but he knew he would get them sooner or later, and that he may get them the hard way. 𝐻𝐸 decided to leave him to his patrol and went the opposite way to continue the last hours of his patrol. He didn't let up on Cloak yet. He needed to be careful with it now that he knew he couldn't feel Eraserhead's quirk. While he wasn't completely untrusting of the hero, he wasn't going to have another interaction with him today, or maybe even for a while. 𝐻𝐸 didn't give Eraserhead a way to contact him, so any more interactions will now be mostly under 𝐻𝐸's terms, because he now wasn't going to let up Cloak as much during patrol. He wasn't sure how this team-up was going to work, but if it meant that he could help save people, then he'll do it. That's all it is, just a team-up between a vigilante and a hero. Nothing strange about that. Have you heard of the vigilante Rabbit? 𝐀𝐸 asked a few days ago. 𝐲𝐿 looked up from the paperwork that he was there to pick up. I only found out about him after he burnt down one of the potential trafficking ring places I was looking into. He's popular with civilians, right? 𝐀𝐸 nodded. Yeah, he is. He's been pretty much unseen by heroes for around 3 or 4 years now. Okay, so why are you asking me this? You do know that I won't be able to take on another case, right? 𝐲𝐿 asked. He knew that heroes were usually the ones to track down vigilantes, and that those heroes were usually underground. 𝐲𝐿 didn't have an issue with vigilantes that did a good job. Some of them have only caused destruction, but from what he's heard, besides the arson, Rabbit has done a good job. He didn't necessarily think that he needed to be imprisoned, but instead, he needed to just be brought to the right side of the law. What Rabbit is doing is a good thing, but it's still illegal. 𝐲𝐿 knew that he would probably be asked to do it based on what the detective was saying, but he just didn't have the time with the trafficking ring situation that he was dealing with. I'm not necessarily telling you to take him in. I'm suggesting that you work with him. 𝐲𝐿 looked at the detective with a confused look on his face. Work with him? Why would I have to work with him? 𝐀𝐸 slid over a folder. He burned down all of the evidence that we had for these spots, so we know he has information that may be useful to us. He's good at taking down the rings. He goes in, does what he needs to do, and then gets out quickly. It's something that not many pros can't do sometimes. I would suggest that we just arrest him and play with the law to get him in school, but with Rabbit's ability to escape easily, I doubt that will work. I doubt that he would hear us out on that plan, so I say that we get someone to know him, to keep an eye on him, 𝐀𝐸 explained. So you think I'm the right person for the job? 𝐲𝐿 asked. The detective nodded. I don't care how you do it, but I think that this is the best way to go about this. When 𝗀𝐿 first tasked 𝐲𝗏 with this a few days ago, he never expected to find Rabbit so soon. The vigilante was known for getting around without being seen. He shows up at crime scenes and then flees them before any hero or police can catch a glimpse of him. The only reason they know what he looks like is from civilian and criminal descriptions. His quirk is thought to be teleportation, since usually victims of crimes end up appearing at police stations. It's a great quirk to have, and the kid uses it in a unique way. 𝐲𝗏 is upset that he's not a hero student because this vigilante is more promising than half of his students. He was just surprised to find the kid so quickly and catch him at the same time. If his plan was to arrest the kid, then he would have succeeded that day and the case would be over. That wasn't his goal right now, so after getting him to agree to work together, he set him free. He stood staring at the empty spot where Rabbit just was. He figured that this time he was gone, since 𝐲𝗏 figured that he wouldn't chance being around while a hero was still there. His thoughts were interrupted by his phone ringing in his back pocket. He quickly took it out and answered it, knowing that only 𝗀𝐿 and 𝐍𝐴𝐶 had the number to it. "Hey 𝗀𝐿," he greeted, knowing that it was most likely him. 𝐍𝐴𝐶 has only called him on this phone once, and it was when one of their cats escaped the apartment. Plus, if it was 𝐍𝐴𝐶, then his loud voice would have already graced his ears. "Hey, I just saw your text about having eyes on Rabbit. Did you notice anything interesting?" he asked. It was obvious that he was still in the car driving. 𝐲𝗏 could tell, since his voice was distant and he could hear the muffled wind. "Oh, I actually just talked to him. I told him about our plan and him being a part of it. It was very vague, which wasn't intended, but he surprisingly agreed," 𝐲𝗏 explained to the detective. There was a moment of silence where 𝐲𝗏 could tell that 𝗀𝐿 was upset about how quickly 𝐲𝗏 caught the kid. "Well, that was easier than I thought it would be." 𝐲𝗏 glanced at the city. "Don't get your hopes up yet. He could always bail at any moment." 𝗀𝐿 sighed. "Yeah, you're right. Just try to figure out about him and see if we can get him to potentially turn himself in. The Hero Commission isn't too happy about having a kid like him running around who isn't licensed or in a hero course." 𝐲𝗏 rolled his eyes at the mention of the commission. "Yeah, whatever. We'll have to see how this all works out." There was a beat of silence where 𝐲𝗏 assumed the detective nodded. "We just have to play it by ear, that's all. I'll talk to you later, but this whole case is all on you. Now that you have him hopefully on your side, how you proceed is up to you. All I ask is that you report to me with any new information about him." 𝐲𝗏 nodded as if the detective could see him. "Yeah, I was planning on doing that anyway. I gotta continue my patrol, so I'll talk to you more at the station." "Alright, I'm almost back so I can talk to the kids and the villain and see if this is related to the trafficking, but I think I already know the answer to that." The last part was said in a sad and defeated tone. 𝐲𝗏 sighed. Usually cases like this are easy to track down and get rid of, but this one just keeps on going. It unnerved 𝐲𝗏. The thought that someone thought out a whole system to get heroes off their backs was a bit scary. "Talk to you soon. See you later, Aizawa," 𝗀𝐿 said before hanging up the phone. 𝐲𝗏 sighed and put the phone back in his pocket. He didn't like this case at all. Sure, working with this stuff always sucked, but there was something about this case that really unsettled him. He'll just have to take it on the smart way and hope that Rabbit is any actual help. "You did what?" 𝐾𝐻 Whisper yelled. "I may or may not have teamed up with Eraserhead," Izuku repeated, shrugging at the wall that he was staring at. It was the next morning, and Izuku told 𝐾𝐻 about his patrol. It was their routine. 𝐾𝐻's alarm would wake the two of them up, and Izuku would face the wall while 𝐾𝐻 was getting ready and talk about his patrol. "Yeah, I understood that." Izuku could hear by his voice that he rolled his eyes. "Why the fuck would you do that? What if it's some sort of trap?" Izuku shrugged. "Then I'll just escape. It won't be that hard." There was a pause where Izuku could feel 𝐾𝐻 giving him a "yeah, sure" sort of look, but he didn't mention it, which was surprising. "Just turn around. I'm done getting dressed." Izuku fell back so he was lying on his back and looking at 𝐾𝐻, who was now dressed in his school uniform. He grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulders. "Look, just don't do something stupid that gets you caught. You can handle yourself, but I'm not bailing you out of jail if you get caught." Izuku scoffed. "As if I would get bail." 𝐾𝐻 rolled his eyes. "Whatever. I gotta go. Don't be stupid." He exited before Izuku could chime in, leaving Izuku alone in the room and, from what he could feel, alone in the house. Izuku waited, tracking 𝐾𝐻's familiar quirk as it got further and further away from his home. Izuku sighed and got up from the bed. This was almost routine for him. He got up, 𝐾𝐻 left. His parents were usually at work, so he would be alone in his house, and then he would be left to his own devices. He walked to the bathroom, which was just down the hall from 𝐾𝐻's room. Every day he looked at his reflection in the mirror. He has always tried to forget what he's been through, specifically the time spent with his father, but it's not like he could forget it that easily. Every time he looks in the mirror, all he can see is each scar and mark that he gained from his time spent there. One of the things he hates the most is his eyes. They used to be a pretty green, matching his mother's, but now that pretty green is being taken over by yellow. All for One gave him a quirk when he was 9. the ability to not die. Izuku still has no idea how he got this quirk. Nothing like it has ever been reported before, but it was something that he gave to Izuku after an incident. Each time he gets revived, a yellow ring appears around his pupil. He currently has 6 rings. 3 on each eye. 4 of those rings were all from gruesome deaths at the hands of Rouge-Namu that wasn't stopped in the name of science. The only ones that weren't Namu-related were the first and last ones that he got. Those were both self-inflicted, something that pains Izuku every time he looks at himself. It's not just his eyes though. Every single scar on his body was from something tragic, and it sucked to look at them and get reminded of how it happened. Most of his scars could be covered by either his clothes or the bandages that he wears every day to cover the pin mark of his birth quirk. He found that for some reason people question a bandaged hand less than if you're wearing gloves. Wearing gloves in the summer for some reason made people question him, but if he has just plain bandages then people just assume he got a scrape or something. It's not like he sees people regularly enough that they would be able to notice. His most noticeable scar was the one on his face. It was a long scar that went from the corner of his lip to the tip of his ear. He has many small scars, but that one was long and in a noticeable place, so it was one of the first things that people noticed. It came from a Namu attack. The one he was fighting had long claws and ended up getting a good hit in. That was also the day he got his 3rd ring in his eye. It just sucked. Izuku just can never escape feeling trapped by his father, even if he was far away from the man. Trauma sucked, and Izuku had a lot of it. It wasn't like he could do anything about it except cope. Izuku wasn't the best at that, but he tried. If only he could stop analyzing every scar and ring that he had every time he looked in the damn mirror. Izuku sighed and dragged his gaze away from the mirror and turned on the shower. 𝐾𝐦 house was the only place he could take a shower. His warehouse didn't have a working one. He used to either sneak into a gym or just cup water from the sink in the warehouse and toss it on himself, but 𝐾𝐦 gave him a lecture about doing that and practically threw him in the shower like he was a cat with fleas. After the shower, he went into the kitchen to get some food. There were usually leftovers that Mitsuki left him since Izuku couldn't cook and she wasn't too happy that he was living off of a protein bar a day. Between 𝐾𝐦 and Mitsuki, with the addition of calm reassurance from Marisu, he pretty much lived at their house and relied on them for basic hygienic needs and getting 3 meals a day. He knew that he would have made it without them, but to have that support, it made a difference, and that wasn't something that Izuku would probably ever admit. Well, he wouldn't admit it to 𝐾𝐦. He wasn't giving his best friend an I told you so moment. His ego was already too big for that. Izuku would usually walk around town, go to the warehouse, or scroll through the internet while waiting for 𝐾𝐦 to get home from school. Today though, he had a lot to think about. The first thing was, how the hell was he going to work with Eraserhead? The answer to that question: avoid the hero like he's the plague until he needs him. He realized after some thinking that while this would be a good team-up for saving people, it was also a bad team-up for him. Eraserhead could easily erase his quirk and capture him, or at least try to. Izuku wasn't cocky, but he already thought of how to get out of his capture weapon. Eraserhead could also gain information if Izuku was around him for too long. So, what he would do is he would only be with the hero if something is going on with those trafficking rings. That is why the hero wanted to team up after all. Izuku would go digging for the man's phone number like he did with Tsukachi. In his defense, he needed a way to contact the hero if he was going to be working with him. It wasn't like he was going to contact him much, but it would be needed once he found a spot that they could investigate. The only thing that isn't covered in this plan is if Eraserhead found a spot. To that, Izuku says, oh well, they've done it all this time without him, they can handle another. Izuku made his way upstairs to grab his computer to start trying to find his phone number. Izuku had to hand it to the hero. He was good at staying hidden. It took him 3 hours and 40 minutes to find his phone number, which was an hour and a half more than it took to find Tsukachi's. Izuku entered the number into his burner phone and saved it for later. Izuku also found out that Eraserhead teaches at UA. He discovered that accidentally, but hey, it's information. Now it was time to just wait until he found signs of a ring. Just wait. Yeah, because the universe would allow him to just wait. The universe hates him. Of course, it would be just his luck that he would stumble upon Eraserhead in a 1v5 fight where he was seriously outnumbered. 3 of the 5 had a mutant-type quirk, and the other 2 quirks were unknown but were erased by Eraserhead's quirk. One of them had a rhino quirk which made them have a lot of muscle mass, and they had horns on their head that mimicked ones of a rhino. Another one had a dragon quirk that gave them wings, and Izuku assumed that it would allow them to shoot fire. Their wings and fingernails had sharp claws and spikes that they were using to try to take shots at Eraserhead. The last one was the same as the former. They were a cat hybrid with retractable claws that they kept using to take jabs at the hero. He wasn't able to get a read on the other people's quirks because Eraserhead was canceling them. So he was going in blind here and hoping that Eraserhead could keep up his quirk. He debated on whether or not he should go into the fight, but when he saw how badly Eraserhead was struggling, he decided fuck it and jumped right in. The Rhino hybrid was just about to strike Eraserhead, and judging by the hero's movements, he would have been too tired to dodge. 𝐬𝐸 jumped down from the roof and landed a solid kick on the hybrid's head, causing the villain to back away from Eraserhead. God damn it. The dragon villain cursed from beside the rhino villain. Another stupid hero. It's not like another hero will do much. It'll just allow me to get my claws more dirty. The cat villain psychotically commented, extending his claws that had some blood dripping from them and his red eyes flashing. 𝐬𝐸 glanced behind him at Eraserhead and now noticed the claw marks that were on his side. He didn't notice it since the hero was constantly moving and now he was holding his side, so it was more obvious. 𝐬𝐸 got down into a fighting stance, not even bothering to reply to the villains. The cat immediately charged at 𝐬𝐸 and 𝐬𝐸 was not quick enough to dodge the hit. The claws made deep scratches on his side that were already starting to heal quickly thanks to a quirk. He dodged the cat's second attack, summoned his bow staff, and extended it. Eraserhead took this moment to wrap the dragon villain in his binding cloth and throw him against a wall, quickly and easily knocking him out. 1 down, 4 more to go. The rhino villain growled and threw a briefcase at one of the ones with an unknown quirk. Go, take the briefcase and run. The villain caught the briefcase and began to run away. 𝐬𝐸 cursed to himself. He couldn't let one get away. He turned to Eraserhead to see how well he could handle himself, and he found him knocking out the cat hybrid with one swift kick to the head, and for good measure he tossed him to the side. It would be a 2v1 fight. Eraserhead could handle himself, especially when one of those people can't use their quirk. I'll be right back, he shouted behind him as he ran after the guy. He ran as fast as he could to catch up to the villain, who ran off with the suitcase, but was taken off guard when the villain skidded to a stop and turned around. They were out of Eraserhead's range. The villain had his quirk back. He quickly felt his quirk signature and almost immediately realized that he had an electricity quirk. The villain grinned and lightning formed around him. I can finally use my quirk now that I'm away from that hero, he shouted, his grin getting larger. You're done for. The villain let out a large wave of electricity that filled up the whole alleyway. 𝐬𝐸 quickly dove behind a dumpster that was in the alley in hopes that it would block the current. He just had to make sure to not touch the dumpster. The electricity went throughout the whole alley except for the area that he was in, the dumpster blocking the current as he hoped. He needed cover, and there wasn't much of it. 𝐬𝐸 quickly ran out from behind the dumpster. He needed to knock this guy out quickly. The villain's quirk seemed to soften a bit, meaning that he used his whole power on that shock wave. That was a bit dumb, to rely all of your power on one move that may not work. 𝐬𝐸 didn't mind though, it just gave him the upper hand. 𝐬𝐸 went to get in close but was cut off by a short and weak electric shock. Even if the shock was weak, it could still stunt his movement and allow the villain to get away. 𝐬𝐸 needed to get the electric user back to Eraserhead's side. He summoned his bow staff since it would allow him to get hits in from a distance and the material wouldn't allow the current to go through it. He first needed to get behind the electric user so that he could push him back to where the main fight was. That was simple enough. He just dodged under his hand the next time he went in for a hit. Once he got behind him, 𝐬𝐸 hit the back of the villain's knees with the bow staff. That didn't knock him down though, just caused him to stumble away from 𝐬𝐸, which was good as well. 𝐬𝐸 heard the villain curse as he fixed his grip on the briefcase. He couldn't give the villain time to recover. 𝐬𝐸 could feel his quirk getting stronger and stronger. Another large wave would come soon, which meant 𝐬𝐸 needed to do this quickly. This guy was a long-ranged fighter and was actively trying to keep his distance from 𝐬𝐸. Long-ranged fighters were usually weak at close range unless they had been trained. He needed to either make it so that he just on instinct backs up, or he gets too scared to fight and tries to run back for either protection or another way out. Either way worked. The villain would probably get captured no matter what. 𝐬𝐸 didn't even know what this was about. He lunged at the villain with the bow staff, causing the villain to jump away. The electric user looked behind him and cursed. He realized 𝐬𝐸's plan to try and get close. The user lunged and 𝐬𝐸 was able to get a hit in, using a little bit of boost to push the villain back further than he was before. 𝐬𝐸 didn't let the villain recover and went for another jab. Ugh, why do you fucking heroes ruin everything? Blocking my path and everything. Fine then, the villain yelled and then turned around to run, the way they originally came. Perfect. 𝐬𝐸 chased after him, noticing that he was heading for a fire escape that led to the roof. It was a smart way to leave, but it also should be in Eraserhead's vision. As they got closer to the main fight, 𝐬𝐸 could hear what sounded like the rhino hybrid screaming incoherently. The scene before him would have made him laugh if he wasn't mid-battle. Eraserhead was emerging from a dumpster that 𝐬𝐸 assumed he got thrown into. The rhino villain was clutching his head, most likely a hit or two away from getting taken out. The electric villain jumped up to start climbing the fire escape. The villain got up there without making a sound. 𝐬𝐸 would need to get Eraserhead's attention. Eraserhead, he shouted. Cancel his quirk. Eraserhead looked over and activated his quirk, erasing the villain from using electricity and getting rid of the sparks that began to form around him. The villain was taken off guard and stopped climbing, which gave 𝐬𝐸 enough time to catch up and give him one good kick to the head, knocking him out. He looked over to where Eraserhead was and saw him landing a hit on the hybrid and finally knocking him out. Izuku summoned some zip ties to tie the villain's wrists together and took him off the fire escape. He walked over to Eraserhead with the villain in tow and dropped him off where the others were. "We just have to wait for the police to get here now. I called them while you were tying that one up," Eraserhead explained, earning a nod from Izuku. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, Eraserhead seeming to be looking him over, his eyes landing on the torn clothing where he got injured at the beginning of the fight. Izuku knew he was fine, but Eraserhead didn't. "You're hurt?" Eraserhead spoke first, breaking the silence. Izuku glanced at the matching claw marks on Eraserhead's side. Even if they were in almost the same spot, Izuku's were deeper. Izuku had a healing quirk though, and Eraserhead didn't. "So are you," he responded. Eraserhead glanced down at his own injuries for a second. "They're not too bad. I've had worse before," he said with a shrug. Izuku raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Eraserhead took off his goggles to reveal pure black eyes that were rimmed red, almost like he was crying. The hero rubbed at them and seemed inconvenienced by the itchiness of them. "Quirk drawback?" Izuku questioned. Eraserhead looked at him with a bit of surprise. Maybe he wasn't expecting Izuku to figure out his drawback so fast. The hero went to put on the goggles but then gave up and hid them behind his capture scarf. "Yeah, I get dry eye when I overuse my quirk. It's annoying, but it's not the worst thing that I've heard of." Izuku shrugged. Fair enough. He's heard of some pretty awful quirk drawbacks. Some of the ones he's heard of, he wonders why those people used their quirks in the first place. Izuku looked back at Eraserhead's side. His own injury has pretty much already healed due to his healing quirk. He used a quirk that he called Diagnostic to check to see how bad the injury was. It wasn't the worst that it could have been. It definitely needed a couple of stitches and it was on the verge of getting infected. He needed to get it checked. "You gonna go to a hospital for that?" Izuku asked, wanting to make sure that he was going to get it checked. Underground heroes tend not to go to hospitals, many of them having an I'll-do-it-myself mentality. Eraserhead raised an eyebrow. "Are you?" Izuku internally groaned. Of course, he was going to turn this back on him. He wonders if Eraserhead teaches his kids at UA to go find hospitals when they get injured. He probably does. Izuku narrowed his eyes at the man. "No, I'm a vigilante. That won't end well. I'll just patch myself up at home." Eraserhead sighed. "Kid, you need medical attention. And so do you. You're the one bleeding out here, not me." Izuku shot back. "I can fix myself up at home. Unlike you, I'm trained to do that," Eraserhead said, like his situation made more sense. "What about infection?" Izuku quickly answered. Eraserhead sighed. "I'm not stupid. I'll clean the wound." "You were thrown in a dumpster," Izuku deadpanned. "I wouldn't be surprised if the wound wasn't already infected from the shit that was in there." Eraserhead looked down at the wound that was still slowly dripping blood and looked at it like it had just called him a slur. Izuku smirked and took this as a sign that he won this battle. "Don't smirk at me. You're not off the hook yet," Eraserhead interrupted. Izuku ignored the fact that he knew that he was smirking. "Like I said, I'm not bleeding," he said with a shrug. "You should still get it checked out." Izuku groaned. "You're such a hypocrite," he whined. "I'm a what?" "You know, a hypocrite. Someone who I know what it means to be a hypocrite, kid." "Yeah, well, that's what you are." Eraserhead crossed his arms, wincing at the movement. "And why am I a hypocrite?" Izuku raised an eyebrow. "You just wanted me to go get medical attention but won't get it yourself. That's a bit hypocritical, don't you think, Eraser? Is this the kind of example you set for your students? That's why you were thrown in a dumpster." Eraserhead, now dubbed as Eraser in his mind because it's easier to say, went to say something to defend himself but got cut off by the sound of sirens. Eraser brought his attention away from Izuku and to the entrance of the alley. Izuku had a thought at this moment. What if he just teleported Eraser to the hospital? He has one saved. He uses it rarely when someone is very injured. It's not like Izuku had any doubts about Eraser's medical abilities, but he would rather be safe than sorry. To be fair, this also made him a hypocrite, but unlike Eraser, he had healing quirks that eliminated the need for doctors. Izuku lunged forward and wrapped a hand around his forearm. He readied teleportation and pictured the hospital. What the hero tried to jump away, but Izuku had a good grip. "Bye-bye, Eraser," Izuku cheerfully called out. Before the hero could use his quirk, he was gone in a flash of green. Izuku smiled, proud of himself for forcing Eraser to get some medical help. He turned on Cloak and jumped up to the rooftops just as the police pulled up to the scene. Tsukachi came out of the police car and looked around. "Eraserhead," the detective called out. Izuku then realized that Eraser was the one who called in the attack, and it's hero code to stay with villains unless there is one on the run, and if that happens you have to call it in so people know where you are. He probably should have thought about that before sending Eraser to a hospital unannounced. Oh well, it was an easy fix. He just had to make himself known, which sucks, but it wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Izuku turned off Cloak. "He's at the hospital." Tsukachi immediately turned to look at Izuku and scoffed. "Yeah, right. He always takes care of himself at home. That man hates hospitals. I forced him there by teleporting him. Izuku said casually. The detective looked taken aback. Well, that solves that problem then. At least I know he's getting taken care of, the detective said to probably himself, since it was low enough that Izuku wouldn't have been able to hear it if he had normal hearing. Izuku ignored it and continued. He may be a bit grumpy about it, but oh well, not my problem, he shrugged. Sukachi sighed. He'll get over it. Thanks, Rabbit. No problem. See you later. With that, he turned back on Cloak and went on with his patrol, not running into much crime for the rest of the night. 𝐲𝐻 almost just had a heart attack. He was trying to get the kid to get his wound checked out since 𝐲𝐻 didn't know the kid's abilities. He assumed that they weren't awful since the kid had been doing this for a while, but he also assumed that he was self-taught. That could cause some issues. 𝐲𝐻 also assumed that Rabbit was doing this alone, mostly because what parent would allow their child to go out unsupervised without a license to fight crime? Either his parents are neglectful or he has none. 𝐲𝐻 doesn't know which one is worse. 𝐲𝐻 at least wanted to check the kid's wound himself, and that was what he was about to suggest before he got distracted by sirens. He turned away from the kid to check the entrance of the alleyway, trying to judge how much time he had based on the noise level and if he could see lights. Almost immediately he realized his mistake. 𝐲𝐻 assumed right away that the kid would take this moment to get away. He realized that the kid most likely knew what his quirk was and how it worked, meaning that he also knew his weakness. Rabbit was smart. 𝐲𝐻 didn't miss how he was luring the lightning user into his line of vision during the fight. What he didn't expect was to turn to see Rabbit coming at him with one arm extended. The kid was quick too, not giving 𝐲𝐻 time to react before latching on and allowing his hand to glow a pale green color. Bye-bye, eraser. That was the last thing he heard before he had a falling sensation. He landed pretty hard on what looked to be a tile floor. The kid had teleported him to a hospital. Of course he did. 𝐲𝐻 hates hospitals. He usually patched himself up at home and then went to see 𝐀𝐦 in the morning so she could finish healing him. It was something that he always did and something that everyone always hated but dealt with. 𝐲𝐻 was now sitting in a hospital bed with stitches in his side and feeling annoyed. He was also waiting for the inevitable, that being his husband bursting through the door in a pure panic and fretting over him. 𝐲𝐻 felt bad since he only goes to the hospital if he's on the verge of death, which has only happened a few times. The door finally bursts open and 𝐲𝐻 preemptively uses his quirk to cancel out his ashes before he makes everyone in a 10-mile radius deaf. 𝐲𝐻, oh my god, are you okay? 𝐬𝐻 yelled and ran to his side. 𝐲𝐻 flinched at the volume of his voice. Even without his quirk, 𝐬𝐻 was still way too loud to be in a hospital. Quiet down, we're in a hospital. 𝐲𝐻 scolded his husband like he was a child. I'm fine. It's just a couple of stitches and the start of an infection. I'm here against my will, he explained. 𝐬𝐻, now calmed down after seeing and hearing that 𝐲𝐻 was fine, raised an eyebrow. You were forced here. Now who in the world has the power to do that? 𝐲𝐻 groaned. Rabbit. 𝐬𝐻 was silent for a moment before he began to laugh. I can't believe a child was the one who got you to finally get medical attention. Oh my god. I have to personally thank the little listener the next time I see him. 𝐲𝐻 shook his head fondly. The kid teleported me to the lobby, and since I was actively bleeding they didn't just let me leave. Another snicker was heard from 𝐬𝐻. You gotta hang out with this kid more often. He seems to be a good influence, he commented with a smirk. 𝐲𝐻 shook his head. Don't get your hopes up. He refused just as much as me about getting medical attention. And look who ended up in the hospital bed. 𝐬𝐻 sighed. Of course, he's just like you. 𝐲𝐻's head shot up to look at 𝐬𝐻. What's that supposed to mean? 𝐬𝐻 stood up from his spot next to 𝐲𝐻. Oh, you know exactly what it means. I'm going to call Kayama and tell her you're okay since I abandoned her with cat-sitting duties. All right, have fun. 𝐲𝐻 was left in silence, wondering how long it would take for him and Rabbit to meet again. Izuku was able to wait 4 months until he needed to track down Eraser again. This time, though, it was for the reason that they originally talked about teaming up for. He found a trafficking ring, and a big one at that. They were good at hiding it too. The only reason that he was able to find it was because of his quirk. The area was an abandoned neighborhood. The whole street was abandoned after a villain attack made the buildings inhabitable and no one has fixed them since it was abandoned. It was strange to feel the amount of quirks that were in the area, especially because they were under a condemned house. This automatically made Izuku suspicious, and for the past few weeks, he's been checking it out to find any way inside or seeing if there was any suspicious activity. The problem was that there was nothing. For 3 weeks of him scoping out the place, no one came in or out, until a few minutes ago. 2 guys were pushing crates that had quirk signatures inside. The quirk signatures were strong. One was an illusion quirk and the other was a wolf mutation quirk. The people pushing the crate also had some pretty strong quirks, one having a quirk that increased strength and the other having a mind-controlling quirk. Izuku hated mind-controlling quirks. He could never figure out how they worked until he got up close and personal. It was just from how he can read quirks. He technically couldn't read what a quirk exactly was. He just came into contact with so many quirks that he was able to determine what it was, and if he's close enough, he can tell where it's activated from by seeing where the quirk energy is the strongest. Even if he trained himself to read quirks, some quirks messed with how he could read the quirk. Like Eraser, his quirk doesn't appear unless Izuku focuses because of the nature of his quirk. It's the same concept with mind control quirks. The quirk signature tries to trick him. They're tough to read and almost impossible to pinpoint how exactly it works, which is why he hates going up against them. Granted, it's an amazing quirk, but it's one of the only quirks that Izuku goes into battle blind to. Not being prepared is something that Izuku absolutely hates, and that may come from his ability to think fast. He hopefully wouldn't need to worry about that though, because now he would have Eraser on his side. You don't need to worry about a mind control quirk if that quirk is out of commission. He pulled out his fixed-up burner phone and opened up the contact that he saved to it 4 months ago. Me, hello Eraser. It's your favorite vigilante. Eraser, how the hell did you get my number? Me, don't worry about it. Demi, I do need to talk to you, so could you meet me on top of that cat cafe across from the shopping mall? There was a moment when Eraser didn't answer and Izuku wondered if he knew where he meant. Eraser, yeah, I think I know where you are talking about. Eraser, what time do you want to meet? Me, any time works for me. How long until you can get there? Eraser, probably about 10 minutes. Me, nice. See you in 10. Izuku put away the phone and teleported to the cat cafe rooftop. It was a good place to hide away because there was a giant sign that you could stand behind that didn't face the street. Plus, it's one of his favorite places to go, so it's an easy spot to teleport to. He sat down on the roof and leaned against the wall of the sign and waited for Eraser to show up. After about 8 minutes of waiting, Eraser jumped onto the rooftop and made his way over to where Izuku was sitting, getting close but still keeping his distance. He quickly used diagnostic to check for any injuries and was pleased to see that he had none. The wound that he had gotten the last time he saw him was completely gone, which is what Izuku assumed, but you never know what could happen. How are those stitches, Eraser? He asked with a smirk. Eraser rolled his eyes. They're doing just fine, and no sending me back to the hospital this time. I'm completely fine. Izuku stood up. Wow, okay, glad you appreciate my efforts. Eraser just sighed and shook his head, but Izuku could see the faint smile on his face. So, what did you call me here for? Eraser asked. Right, he needed him here for a reason. I think I found a ring. And a big one at that. Izuku's tone turned very serious. Eraser's whole demeanor changed. How did you find this? Do you know how many people are in it? Where is it? Izuku held up his hand to stop Eraser before he could ask more questions. It's a part of my quirk. Technically, he wasn't lying there. It's on that neighbor street that got abandoned during a villain attack, but I don't know how many people there are. I just know that it's a lot. That place is halfway across town, Eraser pointed out. And I can teleport, Izuku countered. Eraser looked down at Izuku's hands that were in his pocket. I promise that I won't teleport you to a hospital again, Izuku said with a small laugh at the end. Eraser shook his head, but once again Izuku could see a faint smile. At least Izuku knows that the hero has a little humor to him. Izuku reached out his hand and readied the teleportation, watching as his hand glowed a pale green color. You ready? He asked. Shouldn't we make a plan first? He asked, taking a small step back from Izuku's hand. Don't worry, we're going to a nearby rooftop. We'll have plenty of time to plan, Izuku told the hero. Eraser stared at the hand for another moment. This is going to suck like last time, isn't it? Izuku shrugged. Probably. At least this time you'll be prepared though. Eraser sighed and reached his hand out. All right, let's do this. Eraser made contact with Izuku's hand and the two of them were gone.